So the format for today, I'm going to spend a few minutes with Harry to talk about the reports, just to dig a little bit deeper in some of the things you talked about. And then obviously after a couple of minutes, I would expand that conversation because ultimately we're going to realize that it's beyond demand, it's beyond supply, it's beyond market balance. There's a lot more we can talk about. So we're going to expand the conversation to include other analysts as well. But to start with, let me take your mind back to Istanbul. Do you remember the first question I asked you?
I do. I know what's coming.
What was for breakfast?
My breakfast this morning was some nice porridge.
Okay. Sounds pretty boring. But then also it's probably characteristics of the cobalt market from a supply demand perspective where not a lot has been happening in prices, and I think it's important you highlighted the market balance. So I wanted to pretty much start on that, right? If you look at supply, I think in the report you talked about the fact that supply grew by 17% last year and demand grew by 10%. So surely those producing the metal are actually seeing something that demand is not seeing, and that has led to prices dropping quite significantly over the last couple of quarters. How sustainable is such an environment?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the main thing to highlight there is that on the supply side, cobalt will always be kind of dragged along by wherever the nickel and copper markets are taking it, and that's probably more of an important issue now than it was in the past, where supply was really all from the DRC. With the growth of Indonesia, we're now reliant on the nickel market as well, and as Seto highlighted, we're kind of a rough back of the envelope, you can say 10% of nickel supply is for cobalt, and that means that maybe the supply considerations by the major producers, as I touched on for CMOC, aren't necessarily linked to the cobalt market, and then we're seeing substantial increases in output from CMOC in the DRC, and that's really driven by the copper story more than it is by the cobalt story. But in terms of how sustainable that is, we've been in a period of low prices now for a long time. We're expecting those to persist. Things will get better. I think without a very strong demand growth, then things will be a little bit rocky. But it's really just kind of for the major producers and the developing projects is like just kind of sit out this period and then wait for prices to improve.
So one thing that history is always a good thing to reflect on. So the last time we saw cobalt prices significantly decline like this, quite recently, due to oversupply in the market, we saw, for example, Glencore make some announcement with respect to Mutanda. And one interesting thing about the cobalt market is that, as broad and diverse as it sounds, one or two projects have the capacity to bring the market back in balance. Do you think we would see a Mutanda-like announcement anytime soon as a result of falling prices?
I won't comment on individual operations, but I think certainly with CMOC's moves, even just with the Q1 numbers that I touched on, increasing 400% year on year against a weak cobalt market, I think if those kind of production numbers continue through this year, and maybe they won't hit 100,000 tons, but they probably won't be very far off. Okay. They exceeded expectations with Kasamfu last year. I think there's likely to be supply responses in other parts of the market. We saw the same for the nickel market earlier this year. There's been a huge amount of closures in Australia on the response to very low pricing and oversupply. So it's a natural dynamic in these markets. We're all used to kind of cyclical supply demand trends for mining and commodity markets. So I think it's a natural progression that there will be some supply response. Where that will come from remains to be seen.
Remains to be seen, and it's a good point that obviously we're not naming any companies on this. So you talked about CMOC and the Kasamfu project, and I think you and I have had the privilege of traveling to DRC together to look at some of these mines. And I think usually I'm going to have two roles on this panel at some point. We would open the floor to questions from all of us. And where I feel I can contribute, I'm happy to contribute as well. So please take note of those questions. Ultimately, we're going to open the floor and take these questions. But usually when I get to talk to industry, whenever I hear the term that, oh, it takes 10 years, it takes 20 years to build a copper mine, it takes 10 years, it takes 20 years to build a mine, I think I've started adding an extra line to it. Built by who? And the reason I ask this is that over the last 3 years, I've seen a lot of Chinese companies in Zimbabwe and in DRC defy what we thought was normal gravity, right? And you talk about the Kisanfu project. Who would have thought that you could ramp up? You open in H1, and by H2, you ramp up to full capacity. Is there a trend that we should start looking out for where these projects would announce capacity, say 2024, and by year end, they are operating at full capacity? Or you still think that we are looking at that scenario where it's 10 years, 5 years, 10 years to get permit, an extra 4 years to build, an extra 3 years to ramp up?
It's a good point. I think it depends where you are in the world, for sure. Like here in the US, the permitting process is very long. And I still think on average we're looking at 5, 10, 15 years in Europe and in North America. Other parts of the world it can be quicker. I think Kisanfu is an anomaly. I don't think we should start assuming that mining projects can ramp up in 6 months because it's just not realistic. Even when we were in the Congo last year, people were commenting that Kisanfu didn't have any power. Yep. So the fact that we got to this position now is still mind-boggling. But yeah, I wouldn't read too much into it. I think it does depend on the operator. It depends on where you are in the world. But at Benchmark, we're kind of still considering that the upstream takes 5, 10 years, but the downstream is very quick. We're seeing projects come on very quickly in the downstream, as long as you've got the expertise. And it's the permitting and it's the qualification periods that can cause lags in the system.
Yeah. Let's go to demand, right? I think one interesting thing is obviously the fact that batteries, specifically electric vehicle, take about 45% of the market share according to the report, and that is set to increase to, I think, over 60% by 2030. And for me, whenever I hear this, it sounds like an opportunity, but that could also potentially be a risk, right? So when you think about demand and the fact that one end market controls such considerable amount of the share, what comes to mind? Like, do you see that as a risk for the market, or you think it's an opportunity? And I'll come to why later.
I think for Cobalt it's certainly an opportunity. The kind of the traditional market sectors are not seeing considerable demand growth. We're kind of talking 1%, 2%, 3% per year. But for electric vehicle batteries or lithium-ion batteries in general, we're seeing tens of percent per year. So it's transformed the market already, and it will continue to do that for Cobalt. So without that, there wouldn't be the demand growth that we're seeing. It is, of course, a risk. It's quite heavily leveraged off a single market. And that's why it's important to understand cathode chemistries and where Cobalt sits precisely within the performance characteristics of batteries. There is constant talk about substitution for Cobalt, removing it from chemistries, both for a cost reason and for traceability and sustainability reasons. With declining prices, that kind of conversation has settled down a little bit, but I think it will always be in the background. But I think it's clear that over the last few years there's been a lot of push to remove Cobalt from chemistries, and it hasn't been particularly successful. They've tried to go to 811 or even higher for NCM, and really haven't got there. And certainly for the ex-China producers, they're now looking more at the 622s and even like the 7 series as the kind of the sweet spot, balancing performance but also stability and safety.
So I'm going to have a question for you, the audience. How many of you are familiar with the movie The Current War? Current War between Thomas Edison. So back in the days, over 120 years ago, when the world was not decided on whether AC or DC electricity should be the dominant one. Anyone? If you haven't, I'll recommend it for you. It was between Thomas Edison and George Westinghouse, and both of them had very interesting and very aggressive market penetration strategies to prove to the world that AC or DC will be the dominant current. So Harry, LFP or NMC, which one will win the war?
Without
single answers, please.
I'm going to sit on the fence because that's actually what our view is that we are seeing a fairly balanced view. LFP did overtake NCM last year, but it's still very much a China story, and it's likely to remain the case. I think that I talked on qualification periods earlier on. It won't switch overnight. Each stage of the battery supply chain has got very stringent and drawn out qualification periods that can be 1-2 longer years. So that means that we are somewhat baked into the existing vehicle rollout. So we're not expecting any major change. They do serve different parts of the market. I think there's kind of increasing overlap in the mid-market between the two chemistries, and that's probably where some of the competition is. And we're seeing kind of manganese added to LFP for LMFP, and we're seeing some kind of NMX technologies as well, maybe in the middle, and some of the high performance. But yeah, I will sit on the fence because that's what our view is. And LFP has strengthened in the recent years, but in the mid to long term, we're seeing kind of fairly neck and neck.
But still on that, where do you see growth in the EV market from a regional perspective, right? Is it China, is it Europe, or is it the US?
The US is probably the furthest behind in terms of EV numbers. They're a bit late to the party. I think,
as always,
I think the IRA will change that. It's been transformative for the downstream. There's a nice chart in the report. I'll plug the report again about the growth in the battery pipeline since the IRA was announced. The US was miles behind in August 2022, and now they're pretty neck and neck with the EU. So that really just demonstrates how important the IRA has been for downstream development. Hasn't quite moved upstream yet, but I think in the midstream as well. But that will happen with time. Yeah, I think the US probably has the most growth potential just because they're from a lower base. China's obviously a power. I think the EU will struggle this year. There's certainly more headwinds in the EU than the US in terms of the economy. So I think that's probably the balance.
Yeah, so obviously that means NMC, there's still room for improvement. You talked about the IRA. So also one quick fire. Is it a good or bad policy?
I'd say it's been very good.
Okay. Wait, before you answer, for those of us in the room, how many of you think the Inflation Reduction Act is a good policy for Cobalt? 1.
Oh, 2. For Cobalt, that's a different question.
I know. 2. Just 2 people.
I would
3.
say for Cobalt, I'm not sure. In terms of the overall industry and particularly the battery supply chain, I think it's been huge. For Cobalt, I'm not sure it's changed an awful lot for the US. Where does Cobalt sit within the US market? And even in Canada, there's very little production at the mining or the refining side. There's probably more potential to fill the midstream gap and ensure that the midstream supports the nickel cobalt chemistries in the downstream. That's probably a more obvious opportunity. There's obviously the angle of FTA supply, FEOC, all of those kind of conversations. But I think for Cobalt, there's probably still potential in terms of policy, and I think like the likes of the MSP and partnerships like that will be important for that as well.
So when you look at your reports, what do you think could be one thing that could potentially go wrong in your outlook? What are the risks to your view?
Well, the geopolitical angle, I think, particularly this year, so 2024 will be the biggest year ever for elections globally. With the EU and US and a few other major nations going to the polls, so that could shift everything. In the EU, it's expected that they will probably continue with their kind of broad agenda. Here in the US, who knows? Everything could change this time next year. I think it's probably worth pointing out for the likes of the IRA, Republican states have benefited quite considerably in the downstream already from the IRA. Do
you think they're going to reverse it?
I don't think they'll reverse it, but I think given what's happened to now, they're in a weaker position to reverse it because there's been a lot of investment in Republican states. There's been a lot of state level support at the same time as the federal support. So it will be difficult to completely change the approach. I think the stance on China could shift, and the FEOC guidelines could change. But I think the broad policy will probably remain intact.
Interesting. Yeah, so obviously policy could be one of the biggest risks. And so back to my point earlier on, if you have any questions out of the conversations, out of the reports, please do take note of them. We're going to open the floor for questions sooner than later. And I think, like you rightly mentioned, there's a lot that could potentially impact the market beyond just policy. So at this point, I'm going to invite our colleague panelists to join us as well. And we've got Gregor from the CME, if you can come up stage. We've got Grace from Fastmarkets, if you can come up stage. And then we've got Professor Xu from Antaike, if you can join us up stage as well. A round of applause as they join us up here. And Prof, forgive me, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah.
What do you think of Harry's reports?
Sorry?
What do you think of Harry's report? Are there any views you align with, or are there any views you disagree with?
Just now, Fisher gave a very comprehensive report about the cobalt market. From what happened in China, what happened in DRC, what happened in America. So for most of the point, I agree. But one figure about the consumption growth rate, about the global cobalt growth rate, 10%, is far from my estimation because the price is declined last year. And
sorry, when you say the growth rate, is it for demand or supply?
So the demand is is higher than our estimation.
Okay.
Our estimation is around 190,000 tons, maybe a little lower than Fisher's estimation. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Harry?
It's hard to comment. I can't comment on one number.
Maybe I read the Fisher's report. Maybe in your estimation, you include the SRB's purchase in your demand. Maybe that's the difference. What's the difference come from? I think the SRB's purchasement is not will not happen every year. That will influence the demand estimation. That's
because
the problem.
Some was this year and some will. Some was last year and
maybe
some will be this
that's
year.
the problem. Yes.
Okay. So, Greg, thanks for joining as well. Grace, I'm going to start with you. So, obviously, pricing. Everyone is talking about pricing. I'm pretty sure yesterday, for those of us who joined us for drinks, good cobalt drinks, but then more importantly, the word that I heard the most was pricing. And if you look at the price trends over the last year, right, do you get the feeling that it's increasingly highlighting regionalization in the market?
Definitely. So Fastmarkets is a price reporting agency for anybody not familiar with us, and we assess the cobalt standard grade and cobalt alloy grade benchmarks out of Rotterdam. And we've seen the range on our standard grade price starting to widen out. So the 10-year average is $1 for that range, but today the price is $11.75 to $14.10 per pound. So that's a range of $2.35. And we're seeing on the low end that that's really being dragged down by oversupply coming out of China and going into Europe. And then on the high end, it's really Western companies preferring Western brands. Also because of the 25% tariff against Chinese metal in the US, we're not seeing flows as a result of that to the US. So buyers in the West, again, preferring Western brands or only able to buy Western brands. And I think the takeaway there is that the low end of the range is really affecting the ability of cobalt projects in the West to continue to be developed. So we have, as an example, Jervois in Idaho had to idle last year, basically, because of how low cobalt prices are. And so I think that is definitely a problem. We're expecting that only 8% of refined cobalt supply next year will be IRA compliant.
8%?
That's not including European material, which is still under negotiation, but there won't be enough.
Yeah.
So it's really important for Western projects to be able to keep going.
Yeah. No, and I think later one point I would like us to touch on is the FUOC, the foreign entity of concern. But then I wanted to stay on price for a little bit more. So with the 30% drop in prices we saw, do you feel that there's been a transfer into the futures market? Are we seeing that?
Yeah, so I work at CME Group, which is a derivatives exchange operator, and we have a cobalt metal contract that last year saw about 30,000 tons being traded. And if you look at the...
Is that a big number in your perspective?
You know, we talked I think about a physical market, 200,000 tons. So, 15% of the physical market is being done on a paper basis, what we say on a derivatives basis, which is, it's not insignificant, especially if you consider that this market only started to exist 3 years ago on CME. And so if you look, we have data from the public data from the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, our regulator, that says that basically breaks down, who's holding the position in cobalt futures. And you see that the commercial participants, so that's producers, merchants, on a net basis they are short the futures. Meaning, if you have you're long, you are exposed to the cobalt, to the physical cobalt price, you can use the futures market as a transfer mechanism for some of that risk. Okay. So, on an aggregate basis, yes, futures markets would have helped to transfer some of that risk. From a producer exposed to a decrease in price to a counterparty in the market.
Interesting. So still on prices, Prof. Obviously, China is one of the biggest. It is actually the biggest market from a refinery perspective and even from a consumption perspective. So when you look at the price market today, are there any trends we are seeing in China that sort of correlate with the drop in prices?
Yeah, for China is a driving force in the cobalt market, both from the supply side and the demand side. But as for the price topic, there is a phenomena we noticed that the price of chemical products, for example, cobalt sulfate, the price equivalent is lower than that of cathode. But in cathode in China, something a little lower than the outside China, the international market. So last year we noticed that some Chinese companies, they shift the capacity from sulfate to cathode. The capacity of cathode production increased a lot. Then the cathode price declined, and the sulfate, cobalt sulfate price increased, then reached the balance. In the meantime, some of the cobalt cathode in China export to the international market. Then the balance, the gap between China and the international market will shrink. Then maybe we get the real price in the market with the same, not the cobalt sulfate, cobalt cathode in China, cobalt cathode in the international. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, China is always a very fascinating market when it comes to cobalt.
Yeah.
So I think there's a question I asked Harry that I want to give you all the privilege. Gregor, is IRA a good policy or a bad policy?
I mean, I'm probably not the
That's
expert.
way more words than I expected.
to speak on that. So I'll
you
pass it to my
Grace.
colleagues.
I'm American, so
Okay.
I think
Round
it's
of
a good
applause for the
thing.
Americans.
I think it's a good thing that the U.S. will have more
I don't think
independence.
the government is here, so you don't have to.
In that sense, we see that China controls more than 50% of mined cobalt and more than 75% of refined
Is it
cobalt.
at the company level?
Yes.
What do you say? Okay.
So yeah, I do think the IRA will be very positive for the U.S. and our trade partners.
Okay, interesting. Prof, what's the view in China with respect to the IRA? Is it a good policy or a not good policy?
For the policy, I think China government encouraged the investment to purchase more raw material in the supply side. But China is lack of the resource of cobalt. Through import raw material, China now the leading supply of refined cobalt products. Meantime, China also export the cobalt cathode, cobalt, some battery cathode material to the international market. So, what Chinese companies do will meet the requirement all over the world. That's from the supply side. From the consumption side, China government published a serious policy to encourage the development of EV. But now the policy just shift from the market just shift from the policy-oriented market to the free driven by the market. Yeah. So some stimulation policy suspend. We wish the market will freely run by themselves, not just stimulated by the policy. Yeah.
Interesting. Thanks for that. And yeah, it's interesting hearing those views as well. Harry, I'm going to come to you with a very interesting question. Did you fly in a Boeing or an Airbus?
That's a good question. You would have thought over 26 hours I would have figured that one out. I don't actually know.
Interesting.
I'm going to probably go Boeing, but I can't remember.
Okay. The reason I ask is that I want us to talk about non-battery demand as well.
Sure.
And you talked about, obviously, military, you talked about deliveries. So that was very good data, by the way, using the deliveries of these aircraft to estimate consumption. I know there's a lot of emphasis on battery demand, but is there a story to be told in non-battery demand as well, like military and airlines?
I think so. It's still a quarter of the market in non-battery, so I think that's probably important to flag. And that's really been the traditional sectors for the cobalt industry. As I touched on, the growth rates for maybe the non-super alloy segments are relatively low, 1, 2, maybe even 3%. But there is a bit more support for super alloys demand. We obviously went through a very turbulent time during the COVID pandemic with international travel, but that has certainly come back quite quickly. And I guess Boeing and Airbus will be quite positive about it, of course, but they seem to be more positive than they were a year ago. Yeah. And that's kind of the data translates to that. But I think away from kind of the commercial space, there's kind of clear impetus for military and defense spending. I'm not an expert, but kind of if you look at the kind of the major defense think tanks there, those are the ones that are kind of reporting the military spending, and there's been kind of a clear bump in the last kind of 12, 18 months, given what's happening in kind of Israel, Gaza, what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And I think going back to kind of the geopolitical side, particularly in the US, they're seeing critical minerals quite closely aligned with their defense policy. It's a national security consideration. So I think we're starting to see some of these policies overlapping, which is quite interesting. And that's where a lot of the political agenda is coming from the EU and the US, but also from general kind of economic security from the DRC, from Indonesia, kind of gaining more value addition downstream, but also, as I touched on, Saudi, the UAE. It's like, how can we get involved in these markets?
Interesting. And yeah, it's good you mentioned that we're going to see growth in those markets as well. So it's just the reason I also brought this for the audience is that it's important to note that next time you sit in an aeroplane, there's a cobalt mine that contributed to that. So I think it's good that the public know that the metals that we do care about is making mobility possible, not just in electric vehicles, but then in the sky as well. So I'm going to move to topic quite technical, from my perspective, derivatives. And Gregor, cobalt derivatives, the volume obviously sits at, I think, about 8.5 metric tons year to date. Yeah. And compared to what we saw last year, which was like 29,000. So if you look at this, there's been a significant number for contracts that has existed only 3 years.
Yeah.
What can we drive out of these trends? What are some of the big take-homes that you think our audience should know? The fact that we are seeing a lot. I know, Grace, I'll come on that. I'll come back to you on the liquidity. But beyond just that, what are some of the trends we see in driving this increase in interest?
Yeah, I think, something when, we obviously we look at the cobalt markets compared to other markets as well. And what's really noticeable is so when you open a position in the futures market, we track what we call the open interest, which is the amount of contracts open at the exchange. And so the number is 18,000 tons in 18,000 tons in cobalt metal, which is, to put a notional value to it, it's about $600 million notional value. And so what's really interesting is that you have typically commodity futures is very much led by what we call the front month trading. So a lot of the interest, a lot of the activity is the front month, and then you roll it forward on a monthly basis. In cobalt, 40% of the open interest on our exchange is beyond the front year. Now it's in 2025 all the way out till December 2026. And so we're neutral parties, we're not privy to why people trade a certain way, but typically when you have a lot of forward trading, that indicates, there's this forward thinking, I need to hedge my production or my consumption, for the future, not for today, not for this month, but for an extended horizon. So I think that, points to the industry being quite proactive in managing risk, in trying to offset some of that price risk. We've seen the spot price move, it can hurt, right? And so I think on the derivative side, we're really seeing the one way to mitigate that.
Interesting.
And one further thing I could add, because when we talk about the spot price, it is, where it is today, I think $13-14. If you look at the forward curve, so it's not a price forecast, so CME doesn't do price forecasting, but what we see is the market activity for deferred month, we see the price at $17-18, which is which is a contango situation where the forward trades above the front month or nearby contract. And I think, Harry, in your report you also mentioned that we're in an oversupplied market today, but I think you're saying by mid to late 2020s, the balance will tighten. We could see a deficit. So, without doing a price forecasting, I can look at the forward curve and it says, well, actually, the forward trading is at a premium to spot. Like there's an expectation that...
And I'm assuming that means that the market is beginning to tighten, or people see the market tightening down the line?
Yeah, it's not... it's not a function directly. It's not an expectation of future spot prices. It's just like, where do you see the forward situation versus today? And you see, a contango would typically indicate you see it tighter going forward.
Interesting.
It's interesting because it kind of lines up with our view of the balance and the price projections going forward. So then and we don't use that kind of basis for price forecasting, but it's interesting that the two things are somewhat overlapping.
We're lucky here because it's aligned. It doesn't always align, but in this case, it's I looked at the report obviously, and it was like, that's. The futures curve is in a solid contango in cobalt. So that's
just a quick one, just a quick follow-up.
Sure,
sorry, Kwasi. It's interesting what you say about kind of the increasing open interest. Is that a trend that we've seen as the cobalt market's been more oversupplied? Is that obviously the futures contract isn't particularly old, but has the increased forward open interest been more aggressive since the market's been more oversupplied?
That's a good question. Our open interest has risen quite quickly, but it's been relatively stable. So you haven't really seen big. We got to 20,000 tons at some point, I think 18 months ago, and now it's been around this level, which kind of shows, the companies that are active kind of maintain their position and roll it forward. Or there's been a replacement, right? You can have some people who had a net short or net long position, and then they went out of it, and someone else took that open interest. But it's been stable over time, over the cycle. But again, as you say, we're looking at only 3 full years of trading, which is, for our commodity market, is a very limited time spent to make strong statements about it.
Grace, are we seeing liquidity in your benchmarks?
So Fastmarkets underpins the CME standard grade contract. It's the midpoint of our range. And, I think with the range widening that we're asked if that affects liquidity. But, April was the second highest month in the last 12 months for contract lots. So I think that's really positive. And in terms of the physical market, we've seen our inputs remain quite firm versus last year. Versus 2022. So in 2023, we collected 3,300 observations, and that includes transactions as well as bids, offers.
So just to put that in context for our audience, is that a big number or is it a small number?
To me, that's a big number. I think that is a big number. That means that we, call and email active participants in the market and collect information from them. And each one of those, there's 800 per quarter-ish.
Okay.
So
significant.
Yeah. So we're collecting a wide swath of the spot market, I would say.
Interesting. All right. Thanks. So, Prof, I'm gonna probably bring you in here. Harry talked about the demand growth we see in military and airplanes. So if you look at the consumption of cobalt, is there a way, are there other consumption sources that could eventually come up beyond just the known ones? Or how can we sort of incentivize growth in other parts of cobalt consumption?
This question now, especially at present time, because cobalt consumption now we all of us focus on EV, and all of us focus on EV. Traditionally, cobalt consumed in superalloy, that's the pillar consumption, the field. Then followed by the portable 3C sector. That's the second consumption field. Now the superalloy just ranked the third place in the consumption side. In the EV is a very important driving force for the battery consumption. But now, because of the penetration of LFP's market share increased, and in the NCM materials, high nickel content and low cobalt also deepen the demand of cobalt consumption. So now the cobalt price declined to the 6 years low point. So I think for the cobalt market, the steady and rather low price will be helpful to expand the consumption in the future. That's all the participants in the industry, especially the policy, the countries with rich cobalt resource, should give the market the confidence that there is plenty of supply of cobalt, and there is no interruption of policy to interrupt the supply. Then we give the confidence to the downstream. You can use cobalt boldly, not lower the cobalt content in battery materials. That's very important, I think.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think and it's something that we also look at. So I think thanks for sharing that view on demand. So I wanted to talk about supply, Grace. And Harry, in your report, you talked about the fact that surplus is going to be 14,000 last year, and I can say at least on the supply side, I don't think there's anyone who enjoys a surplus market. The story might be different for batteries. So Grace, when you look at the market today, right? What do you think could change this oversupply story? Because I know how many producers are in the room. Producers, I see Glencore. Are there any other producers here? Oh, yes. So I think what the producers want to know from you is that what might change this oversupply story?
So we're seeing Chinese metal prices at 8-year lows right now, and oversupply is expected to continue, as I think we've all established here.
When you say Chinese, particularly cobalt or across board for all commodities?
Yeah, cobalt metal.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. But, we're expecting, there's been tolling agreements in the last year that have been established, and that's really been a gateway for some new Chinese brands like Henrui, for example, to access Europe. But those may not be as price practical in the future. Those could maybe not be re-signed again. And then I would also say the Chinese State Reserve Bureau and even the U.S. government looking at stockpiling could potentially change, the outlook in the near term.
So is that a confirmed thing that the U.S. government will stockpile?
It's not, and I believe China did it twice last year, and the price kept falling. So, but
there was a short while where it went up in the report. For those who have read it, I think it went up by 20%.
Yeah, it wasn't all to do with the SRB purchase, but there was somewhat to do with stuff going on in the DRC. But they do often purchase at the
and Prof, I'm going to come to you on the SRB in a second. But yeah, Grace, please finish.
The U.S. government is expected to make a decision maybe around August or September.
Oh, that's very bold.
So we'll see.
Okay, great. And do you have any sense of how much they might stockpile?
How
much
demand
capacity?
Yeah. We do have the numbers on it. I'm not a research analyst, but I would also just point out one interesting trend is alloy grade versus standard grade. Our prices, that alloy grade prices have really started to rise faster. So they're now at a $3 gap, and 2 years ago today it was a 13-cent gap where alloy was above standard grade, and I think that speaks to aerospace demand, to kind of get back to that point too that Harry made, that I think that's a small part of the market, but it is positive.
Yeah. And Prof, so on the SRB's purchase, so I've got a few questions on that for you. Are we expecting any further purchases by the government in terms of stockpiling?
That's a secret. I don't know. We just as a consulting company with a background with a government background, we just has the right to give suggestion for the government. When the copper price hit the low point, for the long-term perspective, you should purchase. But when they purchase or how many they purchase, we don't know. That's a secret. Okay. As for the stockpile, I think not only China government should make some stockpile, but for other countries, I think when the cobalt price hit low level, and they also should make some stockpile, because the cobalt distribution is uneven, very constricted in DRC. Now Indonesia is incoming, but only these two countries have reached cobalt reserve. For other countries, most of the other countries, their lack of cobalt reserve. My idea is that at the present, especially at the cobalt price is rather low, maybe every country who concerns the security supply of cobalt may take the chance to make some stockpile to reshape the distribution. Maybe in the future, if you purchase some amount of cobalt, maybe something like you have some small-scaled cobalt mines in your country. That's maybe at present, maybe the good chance to make more stockpile.
Interesting. Oh, I'm pretty sure the government's officials in the room are listening.
That maybe solve the problem of supply anxious. Yeah.
Interesting.
I wonder though that how valuable will cobalt metal stocks be in the future, because cobalt metal is becoming less relevant as an overall product, and you wouldn't be able to stockpile sulfate, so it's going forward as the demand picture fundamentally changes. Stockpiling metal won't necessarily be the best way to go.
Yes, we see that most of the consumption comes from the chemicals. The cathode, it seems that cathode not the real consumption reduced, but on the one side, we see that the cobalt cathode consumption in recent years increased than before because the superalloy consumption increased. Okay, yeah. And from the other side, we can see that if you reserve some amount of cobalt cathode, it can be transferred to cobalt sulfate, to any kind of products. That's just how to say it's easy to reserve. It can, if it is necessary, you can shift cobalt cathode to cobalt sulfate, cobalt powder. It can transform to any forms of cobalt products.
And also, I think just adding to that, obviously government's interest in stockpiling will probably be more military aligned, and in that sense, metal could potentially still play a role. Gregor, one thing that oversupply tells us is that prices might not rise anytime soon. Okay, so if that is true, obviously people will start looking at instruments such as hedging. Okay, so I mean, you've got the crystal ball here. When you look into that crystal ball, do you see that there's continuous demand to hedge cobalt prices over the medium term?
Yeah, I think, going back to my point earlier, the fact that we have this extended horizon of people taking a view and locking in prices in cobalt, and that's, there's always a willing buyer, willing seller. So out to next year and hopefully soon to the year after, I think that's shows, well, for once it shows like the industry is proactive about managing risk. And I think there's also this, cobalt is here to stay, and that people will continue to use that. The other thing I want to mention is also that again, it's a relatively new derivatives contract, but we see people now trading. So we also launched a cobalt hydroxide futures, which is again, it's using Fastmarkets, so it's cash settled against Fastmarkets against a CIF China price, and we see. Some firms are actually saying, no, well, that's actually, that's my exposure. I want to use it. So cobalt metal remains, the bulk 90% plus of our activity, probably 95%. But we do see, some people think about cobalt hydroxide because that's maybe closer to, the risk is they want to offset or they want to take. Same thing with now we see trades in cobalt options, which is, it's like level 2 derivatives. You do futures first, and then options is the step beyond. So again, the industry is very, very proactive in trying to find solutions.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, thanks. Like you rightly mentioned, the industry is very proactive indeed in finding solutions. And look, like I said earlier, if there are any questions, do start taking notes of them. I'll take them in a second, knowing that we're probably the gentlemen and ladies sitting between you and your well-deserved lunch. There's something I also wanted to touch on, Harry. Obviously, prices are low now, but then should those prices start to move in the other direction in future, one thing that we see come up significantly is recycling. Okay, and obviously the sustainability benefits as well, but increasingly is going to play a key role in that. How much, like when you look into the future in terms of recycling's contribution, what role is it going to play? Is it going to play a big role, or is it going to play a small role in the overall market?
For cobalt, so I think last year it was about 5% of overall supply. By 2030 it'll be around 12%. So still relatively low in terms of kind of market share, but if you think how much the cobalt market will grow over that period in terms of supply, the volumes are quite clearly growing rapidly for recycling, and the technologies are kind of starting to mature. There's been a lot of movement in recycling technologies over the last few years. There's now more focus on ensuring you get lithium recovery alongside nickel and cobalt, which was a bit easier in the past. But yeah, certainly a big push. In terms of kind of individual companies, we've seen the likes of Apple talk about trying to use exclusively recycled cobalt in their supply chain, which is a pretty ambitious move.
Yep.
But I think that will increasingly happen, both for sustainability reasons, but also eliminating some supply chain risk as well.
Interesting. All right, so floor is open. Any questions for my esteemed audience, please? Yes. If there are any microphones in the room, so you introduce yourself, and then you give your question. But then one important house rule, so it's a trade, it's a meeting of people in the same industry, so please refrain from talking about forward prices. if you can. And yeah, the floor is yours. I think it's coming in a second.
My question, I'm Agrim. My question is more regarding the recycled cobalt. Cobalt obviously has a lot of indexes. You can see how the market is reacting. But recycled cobalt is sort of a black box, right? We don't know where to look at and how to predict that. And what are your thoughts? Like, what are some ways to predict that, or at least know what are the reference points?
So the question is about how to predict
Not to
demand,
predict,
or
like how to refer to recycled cobalt pricing, right?
Or
Because-
pricing.
Oh, pricing.
Yeah, because there are no indexes. And,
It might be. It's not my area of expertise. It's something we do at Benchmark. We're increasingly kind of adding to our black mass pricing. We're not forecasting at this stage. As you imagine, it would be pretty difficult to do that. But we're increasingly assessing more black mass grades. It's something that we maybe talk about afterwards. I'm not a recycling expert, I'm afraid.
I can jump in there too. Fastmarkets has a suite of black mass prices, and you can track them for NCM, NCA, and LCO, and it's payable indicators, so it would be tied as a percentage to like Cobalt standard grade, for example. And I do think we're expecting to see more recycling in the next 15 to 20 years, making up a greater majority of the supply, and that will be very important for countries like the US, where we don't have a lot of refining capacity.
Yep. Any other thanks? Please, microphone. So you introduce yourself, and then.
My name is Andrew Gully. I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey. This question is mostly for Ms. Zhu Aidong, for the rest of the panel as well. Continuing on the theme of recycling, you're seeing huge volumes of recycled cobalt material coming out of China from companies like GEM and others. And so I just wanted to ask, how are these companies achieving such large volumes? Am I right that they're large? And can we continue to expect so much recycling coming out of China and elsewhere?
Yeah. For the recycling, the topic, I think it's very important both in China and the international market. As cobalt is very expensive, the technology of recycled cobalt from raw material, from the products, not only from battery material, also from, for example, hard alloys, is very matured technology. And in recent years, with large amount of battery materials come to the market, there is so many companies in China to focus on battery material recycled. According to our statistics, the total raw materials comes from recycled side, peaked in 2022 years. That's nearly 30,000 tons. That's the raw material from recycled side. But with the price declined, the raw material from recycled side declined also. Last year, maybe less than 20,000 tons. So I think the raw material from recycled side is very important, but is price sensitive. Yeah. When price is low, maybe the producers prefer to use more primary materials from the DRC, the hydrometallurgical cobalt. Is very expensive and easy to process. When price is very high, then some accumulated stock, the recycled materials will come back to the market. That's well.
Thank you. So given we are on U.S. home soil, I wanted my last set of questions to you all to be related to the United States. And then for those in the room, later in today, we're going to have a beautiful session by an author of a book, The War Below, by Ernest. And then I took the pain of reading that book, which ended up being a delight. You have a question?
I do. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, hi.
We can take one more.
Will Perry-Jones from Massan. So we're one of the largest recyclers of tungsten hard metal. By derivative, we get cobalt back from that. So I should speak to this gentleman afterwards, I think. Question for Harry here. So you mentioned, I think, twice, LFP is a China story. Why do you think that will be consistent going forward? Because presumably the EV consumers in China have the same demands as consumers anywhere in the globe.
So there's probably a couple of, you can think about it on the demand side and on the supply side. I guess on the demand side, you're getting quite different consumer trends for vehicle choice. Many of the vehicles in China are using LFP. The average travel distance is lower. The charging infrastructure is very good. The cars are lower value, mass market. So LFP suits that very well. The likes of the EU, particularly here in the US, I live in Australia. Everybody wants to be able to drive hundreds and hundreds of kilometers on an electric vehicle battery. LFP is just not right for that. And you want higher performance, faster cars. So that's kind of a demand split. On the supply side, all the cathode capacity at the moment is in China for LFP. There's virtually none being produced anywhere else in the world. And the chart I showed earlier on, in 2030, we're still only seeing about 10% of LFP capacity outside of China. So that's kind of, you can see a very clear kind of divergence between those two markets. LFP will strengthen outside of China. That's inevitable. Some of the OEMs are looking at using LFP more and more, and clearly Chinese EV exports are also rising to other parts of the world, so that will start to make an impact as well. But there's kind of a couple of kind of major supply demand factors that are really key.
Interesting.
So would it be fair to say that on the demand side, it's a question of the state of evolution in those markets, and over time, because ultimately the demographics are similar, right, all over the world. So over time, as those markets mature, you'd expect the LFP share to increase?
I think ultimately that it comes down to geography. I don't know whether it's necessarily just about consumer preferences. It's like, if you want to be able to drive a long way, then you're likely going to need a nickel cobalt chemistry than LFP. Like, LFP has come a long way. Some of that's down to the cell to pack improvements more so than the cell energy density. But NCM can do that as well. So it comes down to very regional preferences. The Chinese EV market is obviously already very big. Penetration's high. The EU and the US have got a long way to go. You go out there today and you see the odd Tesla and a few others, but most of them are still ICEs. So there's still a huge amount of growth, and it's what consumers ultimately want.
And it's a conversation I would like to continue with you, particularly on what impact charging penetration would have on that view as well, but we'll probably catch up later on it. But like I was saying, later today we'll have a session on the war below, and I took the privilege of reading that book, and there are three key themes that I sort of uncovered, right? It has to do with policy, sustainability, and the downstream. So in there, you use the word divergence. In terms of policy, and this is all related to the US, I saw a divergence in terms of the government's policy towards the EV industry, or towards the consumption of metals. In chapter 7, and I would encourage you all to read it, chapter 7, he talks about the big green lies. And in there, at one point, you pick a project like Taka Pass. On one hand, you have the DOE approving a conditional loan for Taka Pass. On another hand, within the same department, the BLM, which is the Bureau of Land Management, is actually scrutinizing whether that project can actually go ahead. So in there, once again, there is that divergence as to, on one hand, we feel this is going to play a key role, but on another hand, we've seen a very increased scrutiny in that project. The second one has to do with sustainability, and for those of you who read it, read chapter 10, which talks about the neighbors. You look at Piedmont, everybody within that neighborhood, or majority of people within that neighborhood, understand the importance of lithium and the fact that this project or critical minerals needs to go ahead, but at the same time, they always add, don't do it in my backyard. Go to Congo, go to Chile, go elsewhere. So once again, there's a divergence. We like it, but don't put it in my backyard. And the third one has to do with downstream, and that was in chapter 3, where he talked about the radical work. So it's an example of Tiffany & Co. telling the world they need more diamonds, they need more mines, but at the same time buying pages in New York Times telling the people not to approve a specific mining project. Once again, divergent. So my final question to you, do you think the US is confused about its future on critical raw materials? Because at the policy level, we are seeing divergence of views within one department. At the community level, we are seeing divergence of views. And at the company level, at the downstream, we are seeing a divergence of views, even within the same company, and how they interact with critical minerals. So my final question, like I said, is the US confused on its critical minerals policy?
I'd say that we're only just at the beginning. Things are changing very quickly. We've seen like the FAC guidelines change in the last couple of weeks. The IRA is changing all the time, and I
is that a good thing if you flip-flop on policies like that?
I think it's inevitable in the early stage of such a huge policy move. It's clear the impact it's had even in the last couple of years, and I think it's clearly changed the whole lithium-ion battery landscape globally. It's created a lot of opportunity here in the US, but also in FTA countries. But I'm sure there'll be more changes to come.
So Harry, is the US confused?
No comment.
Gregor?
Well, my employer would certainly not be happy about me saying something here.
That's fine. But
so I'm going to not say anything.
Which, Grace? Is the US confused and it's our preacher critical?
No, I think it's a dynamic situation, and it's good that they're open to feedback, like in terms of the FEOC rules changing. That was based on comments that they got from the market.
And I think what they did for graphite was sensible. There was clearly a lot of pushback. I think that probably other changes are probably needed, but the graphite was very sensible.
And more changes to come potentially too if we have a different president.
More confusion, you say? Yeah, but then also that was good beyond even the graphite, like going the accounting route over the whole supply chain rather than specific minerals meeting those guidelines. Prof, final question: is the U.S. approach to critical minerals in a confused state?
Oh yeah, maybe at present they meet some problems to promote the EV sales, and the EV usage in the silver. But for a long term, it's still a critical minerals for the US. I think just the present maybe meet some problems.
All right, so audience, the consensus is there. It's an early industry. It's allowed to go forward and backward in some instances, but we do believe that there's still progress here in the US and other parts of the world. Could you please help me give a round of applause to this wonderful panel and a round of applause for yourselves as well. Thank you very much.